It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. We're back at it with this October Hammer Halloween theme month, and we already scratched the surface with last week's The Curse of Frankenstein, which featured both Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee as the Doctor and his monster, respectively. So now let's jump about 15 years up the timeline to 1972 and Vampire Circus. This is one of the perhaps lesser-known Hammer films. I think it's one that gets a little bit more attention today than it did in the 40 or so years in between its release and its rediscovery. Most modern-day reviewers like this movie quite a bit, and it's praised for being one of the most stylish films of the Hammer filmography. It's also mentioned among the final great horror films from the studio. And it's even called out positively for its raw eroticism and gore, while being a relatively reinvigorating experiment in the genre. However, it wasn't completely and totally overlooked by reviewers and critics at the time of its release. Sure, the New York Times dismissed it out of hand in favor of its double bill partner Countess Dracula, but the Los Angeles Times and the Monthly Film Bulletin were much more positive on the film. The film was handled by first-time director Robert Young. Now, Young is still around. Maybe a couple of his slightly better-known credits include Eichmann from 2007, which is about the final confessions of Nazi Adolf Eichmann before his execution while being held by the Israeli government for his instrumental role in Hitler's final solution. So yeah, that's some pretty heavy stuff. However, on the lighter side of things, he was the director of the children's film The Worst Witch, starring Tim Curry, Diana Rigg, and Fairuza Balk. Not a super well-known movie, but one a lot of people in their 40s know about. Anyway, Young was a little wet behind the ears, and was not aware of Hammer's hard and fast rules about sticking to your production schedule. So when his movie went overtime, the company supposedly seized the film and handed it over to an editor to create a movie that basically out of what they had already completed. Now, American screenwriter George Baxt was credited for story on this movie, or at least has a credit for story on this movie. Aside from this movie and British Lion's The City of the Dead, which is also known as Horror Hotel, most of his time was spent writing books. Particularly, he had a whole bunch of what was called celebrity murder novels. Now, I'm not sure if these books were about the celebrities solving murders or they themselves were murdered in some sort of alternate history deal. Either way, he got about a dozen celebrity murder novels, and that's kind of weird, but not quite as weird as his credit on Vampire Circus. He says that he only contributed the title. Hammer paid him £1,000 for that title, and that was the only bit of anything he did with anything on this picture. That's about an easy $1,000 that you could possibly make. I kind of want that job. But finally, before we get into the play-by-play of this movie, it should be pointed out that there are 3 actors of note in this movie: Lawrence Payne, Adrian Corey, and Lalla Ward. In a few years, Ward would get the role of Romana, the companion of Tom Baker's extremely popular 4th Doctor on Doctor Who. In 1980, Ward, still a regular on the show, would appear with Vampire Circus co-stars Corey and Payne when they would have guest roles in the Doctor Who serial The Leisure Hive. Ward would go on to marry Tom Baker for a couple of years after they finished up their acting gigs on the show. Between last week and my info about 2nd Doctor Patrick Troughton being dropped from The Curse of Frankenstein, and this week having a movie that not only featured one of the best companions, but also guest stars on a future serial on Doctor Who, I'd be willing to bet you can find lots of Hammer actors in Doctor Who and vice versa. Hell, Tom Baker himself was the star of one of the stories in The Vault of Horror, which was released by Hammer's rival Amicus just 11 months after Vampire Circus was released in theaters. So, small world, right? So this movie opens on a relatively dark note as Anna, the wife of a local schoolmaster, takes their daughter Jenny into the castle of a weird recluse nobleman. This guy is rumored to be a vampire, and as it turns out, well, he is. As Anna excitedly watches this guy about to feed on the little girl, Anna's husband Albert rallies the locals to storm the castle. And the locals are kind of afraid because, well, he is the Count, and that would be bad if it turns out that he's not into what Albert says he is. But while Albert pleads with the others, the Count and Anna have some pretty hot sex. Sure enough, Albert does get in with the rest of the town and finds that his daughter has been killed. And as the locals try to take on the Count, they are pretty much useless until Albert is able to drive a stake through the Count's back and through his heart. The Count curses the village with his last breath, and the villagers take Anna and Jenny outside where they have to stake the little girl and force Anna through a gauntlet. Albert, not too keen on seeing his wife whipped and tortured, steps in. Now, saved... Anna runs back into the castle, and she takes the Count, who's still clinging to life, down to the crypt, and he tells her to seek out his cousin at the Circus of Night. The villagers plan to burn down the castle, but as it turns out, Anna escapes. Now, many years later, the town is still cursed as it deals with a disease that is basically ravaging the village. It's so bad the village has been blocked off to prevent anyone from going in or coming out. The local doctor, Dr. Kirsch, plans to make a run to get medicine to combat the plague. However, he kind of has to beat the blockade. Some believe that this is indeed the curse that the Count placed on them. Some really kind of don't believe in vampires, so it really kind of comes down to superstition and the rotting castle that have been left to kind of fester and bring the disease that way. But not everything is so bad. A little person comes into town dancing and shouting ahead of a traveling circus. The residents of the village are a bit confused how the circus got through the blockade, but that means it's possible for the doctor to get out to get the help that the village so desperately needs. Now, the circus entertains the town. The circus is run by a woman who is only known as Gypsy Woman. She has her little person who is her clown, and she has her strong man who's played by David Prowse, who is best known for being the man inside the Darth Vader suit in the original Star Wars trilogy. And there's an interpretive dance number with a body-painted naked lady and an animal tamer of some sort. It's all good fun. The Gypsy Woman releases a panther that turns out to shapeshift before it goes into the crowd into the star of the show. And it turns out this is Emile. Emile and the daughter of the burgomaster, Rosa, have a pretty quick attraction to one another, and they soon make love in the panther's cage, during which he nearly kills her, but the Gypsy Woman tells him to basically refrain. At night, the strong man removes the rubble that blocks the crypt where the Count is still laid with the stake in his heart. And Emile plans to resurrect his cousin and take horrible revenge on the village. The Gypsy Woman doesn't really want all the children to die, but Emile is pretty unsympathetic. Meanwhile, back at the show the following night, the crowd is wowed by the antics of twin acrobats Heinrich and Helga. Helga is the previously mentioned Lala Ward. Not only do these acrobats appear to have shape-shifting qualities of their own, which happen to be vampire bats, they also seem to have a little extra affection for one another as they complete their act by giving each other a kiss. A passionate kiss. Circus people are weird, man. But a family is led out of the village by the dwarf that works with the circus, and they are ultimately slaughtered by Emile in his panther form. Albert's other daughter, Dora, who was sent away after her mother and sister were taken by the Count, comes back to the village to be with Dr. Kirsch's son, Anton. Now, she found the bodies of the family in the woods, but Anton doesn't really want to think the people were killed by animals in the circus. He's also very hesitant to say almost anything bad about the circus because it's the only thing that's really kind of keeping the villagers from brooding about their predicament. But Helga and Heinrich ultimately lure two boys into a mirror within a tent labeled the Mirror of Life, which brings them to the crypt in the castle. And as they feed from the children, they let their blood drip over the dead count, and it starts to kind of make that little curse come true, that the children of the people who killed the count will be killed to bring him back. But this starts the town rebelling against the circus in some way, believing them to have done something with the boys. Some in the town start to believe that it's the Count that is returning to finish what he promised with his curse. So half the town is after the circus, the other half thinks it's the Count coming back from hell. The burgomaster dies from a heart attack after he and another official in the town go and kill the animals at the circus. It's particularly harsh to see the chimp and the tiger dead in their cages. Now, of course, it wasn't real. I think they were just knocked out or whatever, but still, it's kind of a brutal and kind of sad scene if you like animals. But the burgomaster's daughter, Rosa, is then killed by Emil to provide blood for the Count. And this leaves one last child of the town to bring the Count back, and that's Dora. She's lured by Heinrich and Helga into the Mirror of Life tent, but the cross that she wears around her neck ultimately saves her from them. Helga, Heinrich, and the gypsy woman, who happens to be an aged Anna, which is Dora's mother, break in and remove the cross from Dora's neck. They chase her into the chapel, where Dora pushes a cross off a catwalk and it falls into Helga's chest, killing her and inflicting the exact same injury on her twin. Anton, Albert, and Dr. Kirsch go to finish the circus off. Now, Dr. Kirsch has returned with medicine. He's also brought soldiers with him, as it's been stated that wherever the circus has gone, death has followed, and it sure seems like they are a bunch of vampires. Now, everyone figures out that the shit is basically going down in the crypt. Now, just before Emil bites Dora to complete the prophecy, Anna finally realizes what this means and stands in the way. She's ultimately bitten instead, and it reverts her back to her old appearance when she was taken by the Count 15 years prior. Emil then bites Albert, but just before Albert dies, he stakes Emil with the very stake that had been in the Count's chest this whole time. This is bad news, though, because it resurrects the Count. However, Anton is able to use a crossbow as a makeshift cross, and he ultimately decapitates the Count. Anton, Dr. Kirsch, and Dora are the only ones to emerge from the crypt, while the soldiers start burning the crypt to completely free the village of the Count. However, a bat flies off into the sky, leaving the future a little uncertain. Now let's talk about the three things that I enjoy about Vampire Circus. This is a quite peculiar movie, so the three things that I'm going to pick are kind of a little bit different than what I normally would choose. The first is something that you get almost right out of the gate, and it persists throughout the entirety of at least the first half of the movie, and it's something that just needs to be called to attention. It's a really erotic film. It's actually kind of surprising how much skin and nudity this movie shows off for being 1972. I have often talked about Hammer's use of bright red blood for shocking gore and how much skin, nudity, and cleavage that the women of Hammer often uses, but holy cow, they took this movie and cranked the eroticism up to about 100. The scenes with Damini Blythe as Anna at the beginning with the Count and Christina Paul as Rosa with Emil are really kind of shocking for the era. But it's also incredibly sexy. I mean, this movie has a bizarre balance in how it uses horror and sex. It doesn't really mix the two, despite the fact that there are monsters having sex with good-looking naked women. So when it's sexy time, it's that, but when it's horror time, it's that too. It keeps that separate. And that really kind of leads into my second like that I picked out for Vampire Circus, and this is a very oddly structured movie, but in how it's structured, it works very, very well. This movie is almost like a nightmare. It jumps around within a large cast of characters. It uses its editing to create something that is so bizarre. It's one of those things where it's like, it's so weird, it has to be either everything is happening within a dream or everything is really happening and it's just very weird. The whole setting, because it is blocked off from the rest of the world, almost feels disconnected from reality itself. People go into the woods to be slaughtered, but the village seems to, still basically exist normally, albeit in a terminal state as the disease ravages the people. Now, I think it's also the idea of the circus being this kind of fantastical thing that also plays to this strange outside of reality sort of structure. When critics say that this is an interesting experiment in horror, it truly is. It follows more along the lines of stream of consciousness while playing up to bizarre imagery and moments that feel much more nightmarish. Now, my third like is kind of also ties to the other two as well, and that's the overall style of this movie almost comes across as a European fairy tale or cautionary tale, and actually a little bit of both. It's not nearly as bright and vibrant as most of the other gothic horrors from Hammer. Even The Curse of Frankenstein last week, while taking place mostly within a castle estate, felt more lively and vibrant than this movie. Everything here feels muted. Even the surrounding forest around this village doesn't feel alive. It's almost like it's so shockingly green. It's like kind of part of that dream or nightmare state. So it has this kind of overarching downer feel that reeks of death. And it really kind of plays up the nightmares quality of the movie while also being that cautionary tale that warns of sex and attraction and how it could potentially turn you towards servants of the devil and so on. It's an entire package built around a little darker storytelling and a slightly different vision for what horror can be. But due to the nature of this movie, the way that it was made, the number of characters that get a decent amount of screen time, Vampire Circus is a very dense little monster movie. I could probably talk about this for a lot longer than I already have. But there is one final piece that I do want to make sure I call attention to. Dora in this movie is played by a young Lynn Frederick. She was only 17 at the time of production, but she was already a world-class beauty. This was only her third movie, having coming off playing Tatiana and Nicholas in Alexandra in 1971, which coincidentally also co-starred Tom Baker, who in that played Rasputin and gained considerable attention for it. In 1977, she married Peter Sellers. Her and Sellers had to put it mildly, a tumultuous relationship. There were some reports that despite popular belief, it did actually start off very nicely, but it really kind of deteriorated. She was about 30 years his junior, and he had an uneven reputation by this time himself, and it all kind of became toxic. As he got sick and he passed away in 1980, they were still married, but when he got sick, she was kind of forced to quit her acting job, and there's some belief that she maybe became kind of hateful for it, and it's a unfortunate situation. But a lot of people ultimately very much disliked her and thought that she was conniving and that she was a gold digger. And Sellers was supposedly in the process of removing her from his will when she died, which meant that because it didn't get completed, she inherited almost all of his wealth and estate with very little in comparison going to his children. She did have another embarrassing public divorce with David Frost after a short 17-month marriage. It just wasn't great for her. She ultimately died at the age of 39 in 1994 after pretty much having to live a very reclusive life after being blacklisted following her relationship with Sellers, and ended up kind of doing a self-imposed exile in California, where she lived the remainder of her life in pretty much total seclusion. It's a pretty sad story, but there's much, much more that you can find out about her, both in a positive and negative light, by going to Wikipedia. It's pretty interesting stuff, because a lot of people feel that if she had never met Peter Sellers or married him, that the type of superstar she could have been would have been on the level of people like Judi Dench or Helen Mirren. That's the type of talent that she was, that was basically kind of snuffed out because she had to take care of a dying husband. And it's just unfortunate. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Now, don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday, and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on FilmSeizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, and Spotify. Additionally, hop on over to Facebook, Twitter, and or Instagram to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. You can also head over to my website, www.bmovieenema.com, to read new text articles each and every Friday morning. You can also follow B Movie Enema on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that, B Movie Enema. And hey, while you're at it, go to YouTube and subscribe to the B Movie Enema channel, where you can find episodes of the movie hosting show that I do and see a bunch of clips that I grab and use for my various articles. So be sure to keep coming back to Monster Mondays through the rest of this year, because I have a pretty big announcement coming in the next, probably 6 to 8 weeks or so about Monster Mondays that you'll definitely not want to miss, as this show continues to kind of evolve and grow going into 2022. But until next week, stay spooky.